Thank you very much, colleagues. May I please request that we remind our friends on our WhatsApp groups who are still having tea, coffee in the foyer, who are at the registration desk, who are walking to the auditorium to please walk a bit faster. We are starting now. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mzi Nduna. I work at the HSRC. And I'm happy to see all of you this morning looking energetic, enthusiastic, beautiful. And I can see that you are ready to engage with the same levels of energy that you displayed in the past 2 days. So today is the last and final day of our conference, Engage Research Conference, as hosted by the HSRC. We're waiting on a few people to settle down. I see people are still greeting friends that they have not seen for about 10 hours since yesterday. And so we're going to allow them to take their seats. And if there are people who went to the overflow room, I'm going to request that you come to the main auditorium so that we first fill the main auditorium before we go to the overflow room. So please, if you are in the overflow room, you are more than welcome to come back. If you have items that are missing, the registration desk is still outside. You can go and check for any lost and found items at the registration desk. There will be a QR code that we will ask you to scan for the post-evaluation of the conference. So please, at the end of the last plenary, do not up and go. I will announce it again. The QR code will be on the screen. We will also print the QR code and put it on the door where we had put the QR code for the conference program. So as you enter the auditorium, the QR code for the evaluation of the conference will be there. Please, it will take you a few minutes. We would like to hear from you what your experiences of this conference were and what we should do better next time. So this morning we're going to kick off our conference with a plenary, and I'm going to introduce and request Professor Charles Hongoro to take the podium for this morning's plenary. Thank you. Let us please welcome Professor Charles Hongoro.
Good morning, colleagues. I think, good things always come last, right? It's a Friday. Colleagues, I think today's subject is not only a subject that interests all of us. It's a subject that really matters. We are going to have a session where we talk about, really how do we measure what we do in terms of what impact it might bring. So I thought I could just, I'm not the main presenter, but I just thought I could give 1 or 2 points before I will then introduce our keynote speaker and discussants. Give a sense of what the HSRC is all about when it comes to research impact. For us, doing research, social sciences research, that makes a difference. It's not an option. It is a statutory requirement that we as a council are supposed to do research that makes a difference. That is why we have our mantra. The main mantra is social science that makes a difference. So I think this session is quite proper because it fits into what we are about. The second thing is to contextualize the whole discussions that we've been having since we started, the engaged research. Because engaged research, I've been reflecting, it's not only about getting results and publishing, as we say, but it's also about understanding the journey, the process, right? It's also about mutual learning. It's about partnerships. Of course, ultimately, it's about social impact. But because we have interest in measuring impact, this is quite complex. There are complex processes, complex ways of trying to measure impact. So I'm hoping that our keynote speaker will help us reflect and identify what kinds of matrices, what kinds of processes, and how do we really measure impact in engaged research. So I have really the pleasure of inviting Professor Edmond Marinda. He's not new to us in the HSRC, but is certainly new to others. Edmond Marinda is a professor of biostatistics and is the co-director of Pan-African Center for Epidemic Research Center at the University of Johannesburg. He has done a lot of work in the field of clinical trials, multidisciplinary research. He supervises students. He has published quite a lot and is an expert in monitoring and evaluation, which makes him, I would argue, an appropriate person to help us reflect on how to measure both the process and the impact in engaged research. I don't want to say much more than this, but to welcome you, Prof. Marinda, to take us through your own reflections on what matters or what should be measured in engaged research. Please help me welcome him.
Thank you, Charles. It feels like yesterday. I mean, I'm seeing some very familiar faces. It's good to see, all of you. And thank you for inviting me. I'm not going to be talking about behavioral economics, regression discontinuities and everything else. That's not what I'm going to be talking about. But I'm going to be zeroing in one of the things that are, in a sense, we talk about and sometimes becomes a tick box, right? Engaged research, we went out, we saw someone, there was a meeting, there were 15 people, and therefore we've engaged. The question is that engagement. So I'm going to be talking more in terms of that aspect. When we talk about engaged research, what does it mean? And how do we then say we have actually properly engaged? So I mean, this past 2 days, I'm pretty sure you've read all sorts of definitions for engaged research. Approaches to engage communities and societies in and with. And in a sense, I mean, making sure that, in fact, our stakeholders, whether it's communities, it's government, they're actually primary stakeholders, active contributors, as well as beneficiaries to the research that we do. This I pulled from the NRF Engaged Research Strategy. And in a way, I mean, if you think about it, what is the relationship between researchers and communities? Do we actually involve communities in terms of identifying research questions? Are they co-producers in terms of the knowledge that we do? And then in terms of the information that they get, how do they use them? How is that information disseminated and used? And then when you talk about impact, what exactly are we actually talking about in terms of the continuum looking at communities? So there are various terms that you actually probably heard about in terms of engaged research. You may have community engaged research, community-based participatory research methods, participatory action research, and so on. Engaged research is okay. Thanks. So engaged research is actually sort of a blanket term that includes all these things. Some of these are actually very specific in terms of research in engaged research. But I guess the key question that we need to be grappling with and asking ourselves when we talk about engaging, why do we actually have to engage, right? And if you're saying we're producing knowledge products, we are producing this for who? And how are these knowledge products actually used, and who benefits from them? So, I mean, there's quite a whole list of things that we can talk about in terms of why we should engage, right? For instance, if you want to actually improve the community's literacy on research, for them to actually understand we're doing this in order to achieve that, then we need to actually be communicating and engaging with communities. We also, engage. If we have to do engaged research, it also improves researchers' understanding of communities in terms of the history and the needs. Now, this is one area where, in a sense, I guess as researchers, we don't do very well, right? We sometimes go in with preconceived ideas. This is what communities need, and then we design all our research based on what we think communities need. But do we actually understand what communities need? Do we understand some of the parameters that may actually sort of prevent communities from taking up research? So there is a learning process from the on the side of the researchers in terms of, you know, when we talk about engaged research, we also learning from communities in terms of, you know, say the context. I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. It's also important for us to actually build capacity for uptake of evidence-based practices, whether we're talking about government officials, we're talking about, you know, telling mothers you need to boil your water before you do sugar salt solution. You know, the engagement actually helps in terms of communities understanding why they are doing things. And also in terms of application. So if there is evidence, in a sense, how are they going to apply and accept the research that we are doing? So we need to engage communities for them to understand why we are doing things and what the end product or end result is. If we look at also engagement, I mean, it's also important in terms of translation of research findings, you know, to practice, and also to set it up in a way that, in a sense, fits with what communities actually require in doing. Community championing findings. If communities know what the research is about and they see the value in it, then they can communicate it, you know, to other members in terms of, you know, dissemination and translation. Also, more importantly, in terms of engaged research, it actually helps us in terms of building trust and mutual respect. If you imagine what's been going on, I mean, the COVID epidemic taught us quite a lot of things, right? At the moment, if you think about, you know, our engagements, for instance, with the medical fraternity, if I go to a doctor 20 years ago, my sense was that, in fact, the doctor knows everything and what they are telling me is what I'm going to do, right? Now there's what is called Dr. Google, right? I can go and Google my symptoms on Google, and then they'll tell me I'm with this thing. I start questioning what the doctor actually says. And this is true in terms of the research that we actually do, right? As much as, I mean, we go in sometimes with our you know, elevated so-called positions, communities are now starting to actually question, you know, what is the value of research and what is the value of the things that we actually, you know, talking about. So mutual respect and trust becomes very critical in research and in sciences. It's also important in terms of, you know, undertaking engaged research because it empowers communities. In a sense, if they know what their challenges are, then they are more likely to actually be proactive in terms of the interventions that they do. Community acceptance of research, as well as, you know, greater accountability in terms of the things that we do. So there's a whole list of things. I mean, if you think about it in terms of why we should actually be, you know, undertaking engagement with communities and partners. Now, what's the value of engaged research? Can we actually measure it? Now, if you think about the research that we do in terms of different disciplines, we tend to be very focused on very specific things, right? I'm a health expert. I'm going to be, you know, talking about malaria control. Someone says I'm an economic expert. I want to be talking about, you know, employment and unemployment, youth unemployment, and so on. And in a sense, this is what we're actually trying to change in terms of all those various aspects. But there's also one important thing where, if you think about a human being is not a health person only or an economic person. It's a whole person, right? And then if you take this stance, then communities become very critical, because I may actually go to a place where the challenge that I believe is there is health, and yet people are saying, you know, what we want is we want you know, our kids to be employed. So looking at research as a holistic aspect in terms of quality of life, where unless we engage communities and we understand what communities actually need, their needs are, then we may be doing research that, in a sense, doesn't speak to them, right? So looking at research in terms of quality of life, and therefore, at the back end of it, placing communities becomes very, very critical. So, as I said, I mean, if you look at the value, you know, we're trying to change people's lives. In this case, I'm actually calling it quality of life, although sometimes we actually work on this in very specific domains, which, if they don't necessarily cover what communities need, then we're going to be having challenges in terms of whether that research is going to be absorbed or not. Now, if you look at research is actually a continuum, right? You start with an idea, you know, you design the idea, you go out, you know, you have to collect primary data, analyze, and then write it up. But if you think about that process as well in terms of communities, if you are doing research, at what point do we get in contact with communities? right? Is it after the idea has been developed, the protocols have been, the funding has been done, and then we actually go and say, look, we want to do a survey on gender-based violence, right? As much as the research is continuous, it means the engagement with communities will also be continuous. And then in that continuity, we also need to actually think about who are the different players in that continuum, right? The way we normally do research, or the way we sometimes undertake research, is that there's a call for proposal, we've got our own concept, we go and get funding. So the first people that you actually get in touch with are your funders. And then you develop a concept, and then you go to communities to actually probably just try to get access to communities to do research. So if you think about the research continuum and engaged research, the question is, at what point do we actually talk about we are already engaging? Research sometimes, if you think about the end product of the research, something works, the people who actually implement it need to be aware in terms of what you're actually doing, right? At what point do you engage with them to say, this may be useful for you, as an NGO, even as a civil society, organization. So there are different players, in terms of the continuum when you talk about research. And then if you look at, the definitions as well in terms of views, in terms of, when you talk about involvement, you see all sorts of terms being used in terms of engaged research. People say reciprocal relationships. What does that mean? You give something like collaborative partnerships, mutually effective partnerships, things like shared power and decision making. If you're saying shared power and decision making, then in a sense, you're saying communities should have the power to actually decide certain things, right? If engaged research, you have to be real engaged research. Now, if you look at framework, so in terms of measurements, obviously, we normally have to have something that guides us in terms of what we want to measure. There are different frameworks that you can look at in terms of engaged research. Wellcome Trust's, Integrated Knowledge Translation Framework. National Institute of Health has another framework that they actually use in terms of that. But I also want to actually superimpose those frameworks in terms of the design concepts. Now, let's think about a typical intervention that we want to test, or that we're actually sort of undertaking. Go back to the point that I made in terms of quality of life, right? So at the end of the day, if we talk about impact, we want to see whether people's lives have changed or not, right? But if you think about how that change is going to happen, it might involve government coming in, providing certain services. It might actually involve NGOs doing something else. It might involve communities actually taking a decision to actually do something else. So when we evaluate that program, you are saying the program was actually implemented with enough intensity and fidelity such that, in fact, the outcome that we want is seen at the end, right? Now, if you take engaged research, you are putting that as a framework at the back of all this, all these nuances. You're actually saying we want to involve communities in order to see a change. If I test an intervention and the intervention doesn't work, it may be either of two things. The concept was wrong and therefore it doesn't work, right? Or we're actually saying the way the program was implemented was not intensive enough, without enough fidelity in order for it to actually see changes, right? Now, if community is actually important for you to see changes, then they are a variable that needs to be considered when you talk about change, right? So talking about frameworks, the short and point in terms of this is that, in fact, communities, when you talk about engaged research, become a variable in terms of the changes that we want. Therefore, ignoring them might mean that when we evaluate things, we don't see any changes because the community were not buying into whatever you're doing, right? Or they were not doing, things the way they are supposed to, or we expect them to do. As I said, we design programs, and sometimes when you go out into the communities, what you thought was actually happening there is very different from what's on the ground. And therefore, that has an impact in terms of whether things are working or not. My talk basically, so I know I've said a lot in terms of, it's almost like some background, but my talk really is going to be centered around this concept. When you talk about engaged research, I'm going to be focusing my talk on 3 domains, right? If you look at the definition that I read at the beginning from NRF, it has sort of 3 main things. First of all, there's context, right? Meaning, in short, what's the context of the research that we are doing in engagement? How do we define a research question? What is the challenge and so on? And if you think about it, the question is, do we actually have communities being involved in in that definition? But also in context in general, right? We're doing this research here. If I take a research concept from Gauteng and then I take it to rural KZN, is the context still relevant, right? Whether I'm talking about question or whether I'm talking about other aspects of the research. And then in terms of NRF, they call this the upstream aspect. And then I'm also going to talk about the processes, right? The co-production of the activities that actually happen when we talk about engaged research. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about the impact, which is called downstream in terms of the NRF strategic plan. Now, what are we actually measuring here? Now, if you look at most classical engaged research projects, we say we've engaged when you go and count people. There was a meeting, at the meeting there were 10 people, and that's engaged research. Or there were 15 meetings in this whole year, and then we actually count that as having engaged. The other way, is to actually go and ask people. This is one of the qualitative methodologies that we do. You go and ask them, what do you think the impact of this project was? Yeah. Now, if you think about impact, we can have short-term impact, sort of almost immediate, aspects of it. But ideally, what you want to get is sustained long-term change, right? And then looking at these sort of ways of assessing impact, it has a limitation in terms of how we actually measure impact. But in a sense, we want to be able to say, if we engage today and this research was done, are people still using this thing 5 years down the line? It's relevant to them in making a difference in terms of their lives. So the issue in terms of measurement becomes quite critical in terms of what do we measure and at what point do we actually measure it. There's also a tension in terms of, normally as researchers, we go with our own measurement metrics, right? I want to be able to see whether diarrheal diseases actually go down or intimate partner violence have actually gone down, right? But the question is, are those the things that communities perceive as being important when we talk about engagement? So there's a tension in terms of what researchers look at in terms of measurement, as well as what communities may actually perceive as being important in terms of measurement. And what then this says is that, in fact, we need to have sort of a hybrid system of measurement, where there are important measurements that researchers have to do, but there are also measurements that are relevant to communities that may not be, in a sense, very important to me, but are actually quite important to them. And then if you think about this, then it serves two purposes. One is consistency, because in a sense I can then write my paper and say the impact of this research was to reduce diarrheal diseases in this community, right? But then the community says, what we actually learned in this was that in fact we need to boil our water to reduce diarrheal diseases, and that's important to them, yeah. And then it also sort of encourages synergy as well as shared power and shared ownership in terms of research. So a hybrid system, in terms of measurement, becomes critical when you're talking about engaged research. Now, so I'm going to talk about the first part. As I said, I've split this in terms of measurement, in terms of the context, the processes, and then the impact. Now, when you talk about context here, we are basically talking about the conditions under which the research is being conducted, right? And whether it's an effective collaboration. And if you look at this in terms of scenarios, who decides the research area research question? I've got a very good example here. When I see my sub-SAM colleagues are here. We went to the Eastern Cape to do a dissemination workshop with the Eastern Provincial Government. And then there we were, talking about research, male circumcision in Eastern Cape is this much. And one of the very vivid comments that came out was that you guys are talking about male circumcision. We've been doing this for centuries. Why are you telling us about male circumcision? And it's not, we're not interested in that, right? And then they actually say the problem that we have here is we always read in newspapers there's teenage pregnancies. There's a 12-year-old who's pregnant. And the first thing that you think is, how can a 12-year be pregnant? But there's a cultural thing here that's called ukutwala, right? And it's part of the reason why you actually get underage kids being, married off. I'm assuming, that's the correct term. So for them, they're actually saying the important thing that we are worried about is this is more important than your male circumcision. So the question, I mean, as I said, who then defines what needs to be researched? There's also, I mean, another example in terms of government. So government decides there's COVID, we don't want to see COVID spreading, we're closing, everyone stays at home, right? Now, we did a lot of research. I mean, the HSRC, I mean, if you look at our outputs, you know, we did quite well in terms of that. If you think about the implications for that, our research went in and said, okay, look, government, you did close down, but it has implications in terms of people's livelihoods. People who are selling vegetables at the market now, they don't have anything to eat, right? So context becomes important. If I look at partners in terms of this, there's government, there's researchers, but there's also individuals in terms of communities. And the question is, I mean, who has the power to decide things? Sanchez young man actually sort of talks about, you know, we need to have a communal narrative that talks about the origins and key events of partnerships. The important thing about this is that, in fact, it does talk about the history, the social issues, and then the political, economic context in terms of engaged research. And note that if you look at this statement here, it encompasses a lot of things. There's economics, there's social issues, there's politics, meaning that, in fact, when you're talking about engaged research, I can't talk about a community without understanding what the political environment is, right? It becomes important, you know, to actually think about other potential partners or people who may actually influence whether we are engaging well or not. And then the second thing that we talk about is processes in terms of engaged research. How communities engagement actually occurs. And this, you know, examines things like group dynamics, community experiences in terms of, you know, the research. It looks at influence, power, respect, trust, and communication. It's quite interesting. I mean, you know, one of the things I know my friend here is going to laugh at me. The power issues are quite real, right? We did an evaluation. In fact, I think it's a couple of evaluations that we did. And the results were not very pleasing, you know, in terms of optics to the funder or the person who commissioned it. And you're telling them, this is it. And then they tell you, no, but we paid you. We are the ones who are paying you. So I'm thinking, but you paid me to do work that you couldn't do, right? I'm telling you, these are the results. So when you talk about power, I mean, it's real in terms of, you know, when you talk about engaged research and so on. If you look at, I mean, the process as well, you know, fostering capacity building, you know, for all partners, it's a process. I'll talk about that, you know, just in a minute in terms of, you know, this capacity building thing, which is quite critical. I mean, if you look at the end point in terms of impact. Rating the importance of shared decision-making goals and values, you know, as part of a process. Level of involvement in terms of developing goals and strategies, you know, quite similar to the one before. And one of the ways, I mean, we can actually measure processes is to, you know, to actually ask communities to rate project governance, right? Not very good, I mean, if you are the person who's governing things, but it is important. Now, if you think about this, I remember, I mean, talking to another colleague from here, the HSRC, they went, you know, on one project. You know, you can think about, for instance, a case transfer project, right? You want to go and provide case transfers in order to change an outcome, right? And then we normally have what we call a means test. Who goes into the basket to be given the money, right? And normally we tend to be very scientific about it, you know, matrices and everything else. But you go to a village where the chief decides. The chief says, I mean, these are my subjects, right? The best person to give the money is A, B, C, D, and E. We may not understand the reason why that's the case. For them, they may have actually evaluated and say, according to our, you know, the way we see people, these are the best people to actually be receiving the, you know, the test. I mean, sorry, the payment. Put another way, if you look at, you know, behavioral economics, they actually say if you're doing those sort of transfer programs, you'd want to give them to people who produce and employ other people. There's a multiplier effect in terms of, you know, funding people who can bring in more value in terms of the money that you. So those are very big contentions in terms of, you know, who decides in terms of resources. Now, sorry, I'm going back. There's a very good example here. I think that our colleagues should document if they haven't documented it. I know this was actually presented for me. So the HSRC supported people living with HIV to implement the stigma survey. SANA coordinating it with all the partners, coming in. And if you look at the process, so these guys actually led the research. They implemented the survey. But the HSRC came with the technical expertise. Now, if I ask, I'm not sure who was involved in terms from the other side, the people who, the group that implemented it, who had ethics training. You guys have probably to actually train them in terms of ethics, right? So that's a skill that they actually get, benefiting. I know, you may have supported them with sampling, but more importantly, the group was actually helped in terms of analyzing as well as writing the report. And that's a skill that, in a sense, is beyond, the community engagement, sort of exercise. And if you look at it, in terms of the list on my right, on your right as well, those things are actually sort of benefits communities when you genuinely, partnering in terms of communities to incapacitate them to actually be doing research and also understanding, research processes. Now, the third thing, in terms of engaged research that I want to talk about is outcomes and impact. So this is at the very far end. If you look at it, for people who are familiar with theories of change, we talk about, processes, activities, and outputs, and it's kind of similar to that, right? If you look at all those three stages, the context, the processes, and then the outputs. Now, this is where we actually sort of say, what is the main impact? What is the benefit that we're actually talking about? But not only main benefit in terms of the subject matter, but in terms of what communities believe is the benefit, right? So what do we measure here? We actually measure benefits and challenges. We always talk about impacts intended and intended. And this can be very qualitative. Us in communities, in a community in Daba, what do you actually benefit from this? We can talk about reported impacts, as I said, in terms of intended or unintended, normally the subject matter, but also in terms of cost, right? If you look at most evaluations, we talk about, evaluating what you are, the subject matter, but we also talk about, cost effectiveness of those interventions. You can come with a Rolls Royce of an intervention, which, at the end of the day, as soon as the funder or the person who's an external person funding it goes, then that's it. In terms of outcomes, we look at systems and capacity changes, what have actually changed. And here we're then talking about the long-term effects. We're not talking about the immediate things that, people, felt all fuzzy and everything else. After a year, everything else is sort of forgotten. So increase in information, resource exchange among stakeholders, joint activities and events, funding for partnership work, as well as improving services and programs. And if you look at improving services and programs, that's where we normally talk about when we are doing measurement. That's where we normally spend most of our focus on. And then, the other thing, in terms of an outcome that may be useful is actually to have confidence in research participation. So remember, most of our research doesn't happen once. You go to a community and you are there once. If you go to Pietermaritzburg, our site, you are there permanently doing research, right? So in a sense, people need to actually have the confidence that, in fact, we can participate in research. Then the other one, the big one that we always get excited about, the research productivity, right? So your papers, your grants, your awards. But normally you want to look at this as an intermediate process in terms of research engagement. It's important to you, but not necessarily, sort of to communities. And then digital outcomes, where we look at policy and community empowerment and changes. And then the long-term impact, as I say, the changes, are we seeing change in health, in economics, or not? I'm almost done, Prof. Ongora, I see he's looking at me. And then in terms of impact, quite interesting. Another sort of very good case control in terms of community engagement would be this one. So we did an impact program in Durban on increasing COVID vaccine uptake, right? This program, in terms of the intervention, was actually done by community youth. They were trained. At some point, I remember asking, our colleagues, how is it going? And they were saying, I'm not sure. When we saw the results, it was quite surprising because there was actually a big uptake in terms of vaccination, after the intervention, right? We didn't document the experience in terms of what we went through with the youth. because that's community engagement, right? People would show up sometimes, or they'll show up, we don't have this. And if you look at it in terms of community engagement, that's what we're talking about in terms of what we should be measuring, right? As much as there was an increase in terms of vaccine uptake, the question is the process to get to that point, how important was it, right? And what did we actually measure in terms of that process? Now, just to actually sort of close off, so my discussion points, I've said a lot, is that there is growing interest in terms of engaged research. You will see quite a lot of funders actually sort of insisting on your proposal for funding. You need to actually talk about how are you, engaging communities. I know the Wellcome Trust, the National Institute of Health actually, are very specific about that. And then the other thing is, if you followed me, there's no standardized measure in terms of measuring the impact of engaged research. I'm not talking about the end product impact, right? I'm talking about if I go and say we've engaged successfully, how would that look like? There's no framework that you actually go and see that says, this is how you measure engaged research. Most of it is very context specific, and then is defined by the researchers and the communities. There is, sort of a move towards trying to get some, at least common measures that if we use those, then we can compare across studies, which I guess, is quite important. So there's actually need for new tools and instruments. There's also quite a lot of self-reflection in terms of the type of measurements that we do. Besides the classical research measurement that we're actually doing, the question is, there have to be also measurements that accommodate communities, right? In fact, accommodating, I'm not sure whether that's the correct term. Otherwise, it's no longer engaged, research. So the self-reflection in terms of us looking at what do communities need and how do they measure things. It's also important, if you look at it in terms of the other takeaway point here is that if I look at the three things that I spoke about, the context, the processes, as well as the impact, there are measures that we can use across. If people want to talk about how do you perceive the context, how do you perceive the processes and the impact, is the same measurement that I'm actually using, across the three cycles. And then the thing is, it's also important to actually consider immediate effects and then long-term effects. Most of the time, if you looking at context and processes, they are almost immediate things, right? So we need to actually be measuring across the whole spectrum in terms of, and then obviously integrating our qualitative and quantitative methods, because in a sense, they actually capture complex processes, much more. And then the other thing, I guess the most important thing is engaged research is not actually an afterthought. You can't say you are engaging people when you are collecting data. Right? If it's a process that will start, then engagement has to somehow start at the beginning. Yeah, I'm going to stop here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Marinda, for sharing with us quite a lot of information, what I would call, at least concepts, toolboxes, frameworks, and again, emphasizing the process that communities have to be part of the process right from the beginning to the end. So I think we really take note of that. I know that people might have questions and so on, but I think for the sake of time, if you can allow me, I would bring the discussions to come, make their inputs, and then we can have the exchanges after that. So, colleagues, I think you can come and sit here. Yes. Maybe whilst they're sitting, I just do quick introductions. Their profiles are quite long. So, yeah, you can have a seat there. So our first discussant is going to be Dr. Salome Wawire from Science for Africa. She's a social scientist with unique training in anthropology, focusing on demography and health. Many years of experience working in multidisciplinary approaches, both qualitative and quantitative methodologies. And her research has been she has published significantly She's a senior program officer leading development of social sciences and humanities. So she's the appropriate person, I mean, for us really to hear what she thinks about the measurement of engaged research. Our second discussant is Professor Timothy Stanton. Dr. Stanton is a senior engaged scholar with Ravenson Associates. I hope I pronounced it correctly. Dr. Stanton is a consultant in community engaged scholarship across the US, Africa, and Asia. At Stanford University, he led Being Overseas Studies program in Cape Town, co-funded the Community Health Concentration at the medical school, and directed the Haas Center for Public Services. He has served as a Fulbright specialist with the HSRC with us, so, and advised South Africa's Community Higher Education Service Partnership program. He also co-authored the Research University Engaged Scholarship Toolkit and has published widely and also does postgraduate supervision. The third discussant is our own again, Dr. Mercy Ngugu. Dr. Mercy is based in our Impact and Evaluation Unit, which is in the Research Impact Division led by Dr. Nduna, the person who introduced me. She's a mathematician and a data scientist, grounded. She does a lot of these evaluations and with a wealth of experience in evaluations and modeling. So we are going to get their inputs in terms of the presentation made. So I would like to start by giving the floor to Dr. Salome to give us your inputs, and then we'll move to Prof. Stanton and then Dr. Gungu. Please, you can go ahead. Is it?
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity to be here, to listen to all these good presentations. And thank you, Prof, for such a detailed and well thought out presentation. So my thoughts, I think I'll just pick up from where Prof left, talking about engaged research not being an afterthought. I totally agree with that position. And from a funder's perspective, there is increasing interest in having engagement in all the research that is happening, even for the for the natural sciences, that there is interest to have a lot more engagement, to encourage different kinds of outcomes, including things like science citizenship, but also like the many items that Prof actually pointed out in terms of the benefits of having engaged research. So from Science for Africa Foundation, we are very, very keen on this. And sometimes our calls come out and we are very specific, we need this as part of it, but in some cases we are not. We would like to to make it clear that engagement is a key part of it, and we look at the intentionality of it. Most of the proposals we get sometimes just dance around the aspect of engaged research, very tokenistic. Oh, we are going to talk to this community and the other community. But when you look deeper into the proposal, there's no real framework that actually shows the pathway for this engagement. You do not even have social scientists as part of your team, yet you're talking about all this in terms of engaged research. When you look at the budget does not have, much in terms of engagement. Most of the budget is travel and salaries and things like that. So the intentionality has to come out clearly in most of these proposals for you to have to actually show that you really are interested in doing engaged research. And we've got argument from different research communities that impact, especially when we are talking about engaged research, can be very difficult to measure. We don't have standardized metrics and such frameworks to measure outputs or impact with regards to engaged research. So one of the things we encourage researchers is to approach it through learnings, because impact can take a long time. You can have a learning agenda so that as the project goes on, there's a lot of learnings you can have and actually use those as part of engagement with the communities which you work. The other thing, apart from that, I just want to speak a little bit outside of what Prof has presented here, which is about impact in the research institutions or in academia. Engaged, when you look at most academic institutions, universities, they have the mandate to teach, to do research. And then there's a third one, which is usually community engagement. In most of our institutions, the third mandate, in most cases, is not measured. It doesn't count. So that as much as you do the research and you engage communities, at the end of the day, what counts is how much you have published. Which journals have you published in? How many citations have you received? All those, I'm sure you all know those, but none of them actually address the aspect of community engagement, which is where we are in terms of engaged research. So much so that most of our researchers in our higher education institutions are really just more concerned about their personal career growth. So they just really concentrate on those two aspects which are recognized and leave out the engagement part. So this is a discussion that needs to be held at that level for recognition of engagement. It is there, it's on paper, but practically it's not counting. So I think that's just a thought provocation for discussion. Thank you.
Good morning, colleagues, and thank you for that wonderful talk, Prof. Edmore. I learned a lot from you, and I'll comment on a few aspects of it and then try to briefly put an overlay onto what you did that I hope will be helpful. I also need to just say that I've been a practitioner of CBPR for a long time in the US and here in South Africa and elsewhere. And but the P in that in those letters, as for me, has always been partnership rather than participatory. And this is partially because I've done most of my research projects with students, undergraduate students and medical students from Stanford. And they often don't have the skills and the time to engage and coordinate and organize real participatory efforts. And so a lot of the projects that we were engaged with would fall short on the participation continuum, but they were very much grounded in partnership. And that's always been important to me. And so I just wanted to offer that as a kind of context for my remarks. One thing you offered in your talk, which I hadn't thought about before and I really enjoyed listening to and then thinking about, is what you called the hybrid approach. And you talked mainly, I think, if I understood, about the combination of, issues and challenges that are common across communities versus what's local in a specific context in which we work. And that is a challenge. And I thought of two more. One was the challenge between integrating academic values, which we just heard about, with social action, grounded social action that brings about concrete, practical change, which isn't valued and often or even understood, at least in academies that I've worked in. So that's a challenge for those of us doing this work. And the third one that came to mind, particularly when I saw you had drawn some of your remarks from the New Mexico Center, which does wonderful work, was the hybridization between the research institutions, ethics standards and committees, and communities, some of which have their own so-called ethics committees. And I think of Native American communities in the Southwest, where researchers cannot enter those committees without passing through the ethics committee of the community, as well as whatever ethics committees they have to contend with on their campuses or in their institutions. And there can be great conflict between those two areas. And so hybridization is an ongoing challenge, I think, in this work, and I really appreciated that concept. I also want to echo that assessment is not an afterthought, because when I first started this work, and I didn't really know what I was doing, assessment was indeed an afterthought. And I could tell you a brief story about the catastrophe that brought about, because we hadn't really built into the beginning of the project the assessment function. We didn't have funding to support it, and that assessment was an add-on. I was provided funding to hire an evaluator to evaluate a project that we're engaged in. She spent 9 months researching our project, turned over every stone she could think of in terms of people to interview, from students to grandparents, community members. These were work in a school district, so she looked at test scores, grades, discovered that the record keeping in the district was chaotic and hazardous, and those data weren't all that valuable. And by the end of the 9 months she worked, she said, "I've got a lot of data, but I can't say anything conclusive about this project." And she had to give a public presentation on this work. And so she said, "What should I say?" And I said, "Just tell your story, and you did the best you can." And so she did. And then at the end of her presentation, the school district superintendent that had invited us in to do this work stood up and said, "Well, that's great work you've done, and I'd really appreciate all the hard work you did, but you forgot to check one source of information about this project, and that was me, the superintendent." And neither the evaluator nor I had thought about that, because we thought the superintendent had invited us in and appreciated what we were doing, but really was not involved in the day-to-day ongoing work in classrooms, which is what we were looking at. And she said, "If you had come to me, I would have told you that we don't know much about teaching and learning in education, but we do know that time on task does yield learning." And so if you had asked me, why do I have this program where Stanford people are in our schools doing this work, a lot of which was tutoring, she said, "I don't care what they do with my students." She said, "What actually matters to me is that we know that our kids who have paired up with Stanford people who are in our schools come to school more often than the other kids. And so it doesn't matter to me what they do as long as they keep coming, because I know when they're in our classrooms, our kids will be in the classrooms. And attendance is a big problem in that school district." So that was an afterthought effort in this work that led us into a very flawed study, really. And so, Firstly, I think we failed because it was an add-on. The evaluator, she was great. She did wonderful work, but she really didn't know the program. She didn't work with our staff as we developed the program. She didn't know the district or the teaching staff, and she didn't know the community. So, you know, it was an add-on, drop in, drop out kind of evaluation and assessment, and it didn't work very well. So that I think is common in the my experience is very common, I think, at least what I've observed. And so that what we heard in the talk this morning, how important it is that the assessment function needs to be built in from day one. And it needs to be part of the ongoing development of the research, the ongoing development of the partnership that supports the research, when with everybody engaged. So when you get to the looking at the culmination of the research and what the impacts might be, the community-based knowledge is deep, and the knowledge of what's been uncovered in the research is contextually sound and grounded. I think another challenge in this work, just briefly mentioned, is that researchers are finding, as you may know, that actual impacts from engaged research don't show up for 12 or 36 months after the project. And that's a problem because those of us in the academy or in the research institutions, we finish the research and we get pulled into new projects. We're out fundraising to support a new project while the community is struggling still to implement whatever our findings might have been. And to find the actual impacts of all of that activity and learning just doesn't happen instantaneously. And so there's a mismatch, I think, between how things actually happen in communities and how things are looked upon and understood and assessed in the academy, at least academies that I've been in part of. And that's very hard to contend with because the kind of cultural expectations for researchers and faculty members and even students in academies are short-term, and they just don't fit well with communities where change is long-term. It's not a straight line. It's hard to know when things really take hold, a particular intervention, and you just may not know for a while. So we really need in this work, I think, to think very critically about how do we contend with this and how do we maintain some kind of post-project analysis in partnership with our community partners, so that we stay in touch with each other. And I just mentioned very briefly that there are some institutions in the US who are beginning to contend with this and are actually creating positions called research project managers or coordinators who coordinate research partnerships across a number of projects in a particular region to kind of look at regional impact of their efforts. And the University of Pittsburgh, for one, is really a leader in this work, and I recommend you take a look at what they're doing. So those are just brief remarks. I know our time is short. I told Charles I really hoped we'd have time for questions, so I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you to Professor Marinda. It was a privilege, particularly for me, to work under your mentorship, and no day would start without us opening the archives of models and logic frameworks. So it's such a good morning that now we get to contextualize this in ways that we speak to the communities that we serve. Thanks for that insightful presentation. I'm just going to be reflecting on what the other discussants have also mentioned, and then I will add a little bit of an input on emerging technologies that we need now to be looking towards in the era of artificial intelligence. So, Prof, you have reminded us that engaged research is not an afterthought. It's not just a tick box that we tick at the end of a funding proposal, but it's a living relationship that we build, trust that we're going to build with the communities that we serve and that we work with. As fellow researchers and fellow statisticians who are here, Prof. Ngilani, fellow data scientists who are here, a typical day for us starts with our numbers in SPSS, SATA, Power BI, trying to visualize counts, but not the voices that we cannot really count. And we seem to be very organized people. Of course, we are very organized, and we all want clean scorecards, clean indicators. Don't we all love that? But in this current era of technologies, we have seen the power that machine learning is able to harness to detect shifts in conversations that are going on in sentiment analysis, for example, when it comes to social media analytics, in participatory mapping and marking. We've seen shifts that are being detected even before policy takes action. So how do we move towards embracing such technologies that are there, and we move with times, given that we have very rich training data, particularly at the HSRC, looking at the longitudinal studies that we do have, SABSAM, CESAS, the food and nutrition work, and even very rich databases in the African context that are very indigenous to us, the Afrobarometer and so forth. There's rich training data there that we tap into. And recent, well, very traditional, but now because of power of technology, we are beginning to unpack our power of mathematical and computational methods in system dynamics, agent-based modeling and networks, analysis that actually are able to stimulate our interventions, ripple through communities over time. I would want to invite you researchers to look at open source platforms that are now very smart, of course not engaging in measuring impact. You'd want to look at the free open source Impact Accelerator by UNDP, the WFP, Anger Map Life. These are platforms that are evolving the relationship between social interventions and well-being outcomes for us, and that are able to track these shifts very quickly. You can use them, and then the data scientists that are here, I would want to challenge you to see how we can mimic this and how we can integrate this into our systems and build our own systems that speak to the work that we're currently doing. At the Impact Evaluation team of the HSRC, we have started exploring how we can build such AI-powered systems, glowing here and there in their thin AWS environment. That's the space that we tapping into. Yeah, and then, well, as I said, these are very smart technologies, but it is very crucial that we must pair these technologies with advances in epistemic consciousness, what I call AI with Ubuntu. We need to be epistemically conscious, because no matter how tools become very smart, very sophisticated, they can reproduce inequalities if they are based on biased assumptions and just counts. So epistemic justice demands that communities do not only contribute data, but also define what success means and how it should be measured. The future that I'm calling the AI that is meeting and integrating with Ubuntu, for me, is a system that will learn with communities, and not a system that is just going to learn about communities. We need to be learning together, and we need to be crunching numbers with them. We have systems that communities are able to input data, play with, and also see real outcomes because of the power of AI, and socialize with the outcomes on their real-time social media platforms. And as I close, I want to say and to challenge you to ask yourselves, how can we measure impact in a better way? How can we measure impact in a more smart way because of power of technology? And also how just to measure impact in a more justly way, more inclusively way, more fun and more beautifully way as we tap into technology. I want to thank the HSRC for this conference and the organizers. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much. We are not doing so well on time. This is one of those sessions that really would have required more time. But I think we now have the opportunity to ask questions, because we had our keynote giving us quite a lot. We had from a funder's perspective, and I was listening very, very carefully about what you were saying in terms of what are the requirements for funding, the international experience that we got. And it's not, it's always good. You learn from making a mistake. I really liked that example, Prof. Stanton, because you learn a lot from even things that didn't work and bringing us back to the real digital world now, AI. We've been talking about it and so on. So I would like to give you an opportunity, Dr. Mzia. I don't know if I'm allowed another 10 minutes or so, so that we can have people. This is question. So I can see one. We start this side, and then I see Zulu. Is there another hand there? And then I'll come this side. Okay, I'll come this. So maybe let's start with you, Diana.
Thank you. Good morning. Thanks so much to the whole panel. So just to be brief, Prof. Marinda, you talked that you have, although there's a need for new tools to be created for measurement. So given the challenges that have been mentioned today in terms of the linear approach, in terms of projects and the short time, do you have any thoughts of how could those tools be developed, or what would they look like? And I'm thinking about trying to think of ways that somehow there would be a bridge created towards a longer term approach. So be able to measure even if a project, so 5 years later, because I think in our experience, a lot of the things that emerge happen 5 years later or so. And then also aligned with what Charles just said, like also consider some of those tools in a way that they also acknowledge and capture and give lessons from the failures, because I think, at least in my experience, I have learned a lot from the things that have gone wrong in a lot of these projects. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh. So now there are two hands that are this side. So maybe we can take a couple and then you will.
Thank you. Thank you for a very insightful session. I think I'll direct my question to Dr. Salome. Professor Edmore, you spoke about continuous engagement. And one of the things that came to mind for me was, who pays for this? How do we pay for it? And Salome, you also mentioned that this is what you are looking at in terms of being engaged even after the so-called project is complete. I wanted to hear your thoughts about how you are approaching that. If you could also add to what Mercy brought in, because when she spoke about AI, I thought maybe this is a way that could be used for long-term engagement, even if there isn't physical presence. So I would like to hear your thoughts around that. Thank you.
There was another hand behind, so we just decided to harvest the question and then, have the discussants respond. Please go ahead.
Good morning, I'm Cornell Hart, and thank you to each one of the panelists, and especially to the keynote. Two things that comes to mind and that I would like your reflection on. One, yes, log frames, theories of change, spent my entire life with it. And I like the new SMART, which is SMART T, and not the sweetie we eat in South Africa, but adding the I and the E, which is inclusive and equity. And so this comes to my question or your thoughts on, if we say we speak of engaged research, then it means that evaluation needs to come from the receiver, not the giver. And so I've been spending the best part of 15 to 17 years now with professionalization of community development in South Africa. But what I found interesting in community engagement especially, and now in engaged research, that we would speak of principles and we will speak of norms. And so in the principles, we bring in the ethics and the equities, etc., and the norms, but we shy away of setting up standards. And it cuts across, as the keynotes address, but those standards of what I've done recently to develop tools where community members assess us against those standards. So it's agreed upon norms and all these principles, which is what we've moved towards with engaged research. But if we're really in the empowerment generation of evaluation, in GUBA and fourth generation evaluation, why are we not handing over to the community and say, score me, instead of all our perfect scorecards? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Maybe let's get another two from this side, and then, because time is not on our side. And my plea is that if you can just precisely just get to the point, because this is quite interesting, so it's very easy to have longer input.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Sorry. And thank you to the presenters as well. Suppose very three quick points, just in the spirit of intellectual sparring. I was wondering, given the complexities mentioned by Dr. Edmo, how much perhaps should we also stand in the posture of humility in all of this, given the tensions, the complexities, the power dynamics, the measurement issues that we have when we enter communities, so that we enter as curious students into an open world ecosystem that we have no real knowledge of, rather than as learned researchers. Because we've talked about trust and all these things, so I was wondering the place of humility in all of this. The other one is the question, I guess, of in that too, in what was mentioned, the question of attribution. How can we really attribute impact to our work? Because this is in an open world system, it's not in a lab. So many other things can contribute to some of the work that we've done, but it cannot, can we really say it's our work? Or we've made a contribution, and with what confidence can we even say that? And lastly, I was wondering whether we are making a distinction, because it seems sometimes if we're talking interchangeably, using engaged research and impact. And it seems to me as if, from what I'm listening here, there are some differences with engaged research as a modality, engaged research as an impact pathway, and then of course impact itself being the goal at the end of the rainbow, as it were. Thank you.
Good. I think that gives us sufficient, enough material to deal with here. Maybe we can. I didn't ask colleagues in the overflow, but I think we can see if we still have time. Maybe we can just get the response, starting with you, Prof. There are a number of questions, but I can always give you a probe.
Okay, all right. No, thanks, Prof. I mean, very thought-provoking questions. I'll try to answer all of them. So the two issues are, if you look at the way we normally evaluate or we do research, we normally have standardized tools and metrics that we use. But if you are saying we need to actually get the other side, we need communities to actually tell us what we need to be evaluating, what they actually think is important, then the discourse is, I mean, do we actually have a toolkit that measures that? So when you talk about new tools, I mean, on one hand, we're talking about community-led metrics. And the new tools, I mean, may actually be something that is an integration between the traditional things that we use and what communities actually bring to the fore, including, I mean, in a sense, having validating those metrics, right? Some of them are going to be very difficult to do. I mean, if you're talking about qualitative aspects, the question is, how do we, as Messi said, we are quantitative people. It's easier for me to deal with quantitative issues. But those voices may actually be more meaningful. And the question is, how do we then standardize those as? So that's what we're moving on when you talk about new tools. And then the other question was in terms of evaluations. I hope, I came out at some point in terms of that communities needs to actually be evaluating. When they say we need to actually assess governance issues, when they need to actually sort of be saying something about the partnership, it's from the viewpoint of the communities rather than from us. The unfortunate thing, if you look at mostly commissioned work and evaluations that we do, the end point is normally defined. We want to look at improvement in child health, right? But the journey to get to that point, we don't measure in. So it is important for communities to somehow input in terms of the evaluation process. And you are right in terms of, they need to be evaluating it. But if you're looking at the process, including funding aspects, they are not really interested in that, right? They want to see changes in child health. So I guess it's a point that we are posing to our funders. And then, so the issues, you're raising quite critical things. So how do we define respect and trust? And there have to be an element of humility in it, right? If I go to a community and the posture is that, in fact, I can learn from communities. If there are historical, cultural, social issues that I don't understand, I'm actually learning from them. So there is an element of humility that's actually required when you talk about engagement. The unfortunate thing, is when we talk about power, it's also, that dynamic, right? So there's a doctor sitting here, there's a prof. What's the relationship between that and communities? Do I go there with the posture of I'm an academic, I know, and yet there's quite a lot that I don't know about communities. So that humility is actually required. Now, in terms of attribution, you are right. I thought I did maybe not so clearly. So if you look at the looking at a system, if you think about system thinking, right? The community aspect, you are putting it as a layer in terms of some of the things that may contribute to seeing changes or not, right? So it actually brings in another complexity in it. And the point is, are we interested in measuring that? As I said, if we see things changing or not, the question is, what are we attributing? If things don't change, as I said, if the concept is wrong, then in a sense you don't expect things to change. But if you're not implementing things the way they should be, communities are not actually buying in your whatever intervention, do you say the concept is wrong? Which means we need to actually measure and quantify the contribution of that engagement to actually be able to see impacts at the end. And then you also spoke about the distinction between engaged research and impact. Now, the way we conceptualize impact, we normally think about improvement in child health, right? If I'm funded to actually to change child growth and whatever it is. Engaged research, you are right, it's actually part of the pathway in terms of achieving that impact. So those are not necessarily, interchangeable things. But more importantly, in terms of that process, are we interested in understanding how that process unfolds, right? Is the context right? Are things done in terms of the implementation done the way they should be? Are communities buying in? And then eventually we can, talk about measuring impact. I hope I've managed to.
Yeah. So I think that you don't have to answer all questions, but I think there was one quite poignant one on post-project activities. Who funds that?
Okay, thank you. From our funding perspective, it's very hard to justify funding work beyond the funding period. So in some cases, we have, with justifiable, with a convincing justification, we have different ways of intervention, like a bridging fund or something like that, which is usually agreed outside of the original funding period. So depending on the funder, depending on the kind of models they have for their funding, they'll probably, knowing the importance of this, they'll probably have some kind of intervening fund that allows for this kind of thing. But most importantly, during the period of implementation, you can still have these activities that kind of measure impact, not at the end of the project, but really as the project is going on. And this, like I mentioned earlier, this can include activities like if you have a learning agenda where you say every 6 months or every 1 year we go back to the field, we go back to the people, and we measure this, and we learn something from that, and we document it, and we from the learnings, if there's a possibility of implementing some changes within the program, that is part of it. And it keeps you updated in terms of the impact you're actually having as you go along. You don't have to wait until the end for you to have a nice report that talks about all of this. So if you have a learning agenda, you can have all these things broken down, and you have bits and pieces as you go along. And then the other is impact storytelling, which is becoming quite the go-to, because it gives you real-time ideas about what's going on in the communities in which you're working, in which you're doing your research. Like he said, the communities are the biggest evaluator. They'll tell you exactly what they feel about the work you're doing with them. So impact storytelling can be something that can actually be included in your everyday activity as you go along, and not necessarily something that you have to wait until the end and then start measuring. Because even at that point, there will be issues of memory and all of that, and you might not get a very good stories out of it. Thank you.
A minute each, sorry to do this.
Okay, I will try. Just two very quick remarks in response to the question from back there about turning over the question of impact to the community. Yeah, I agree with that in general, but actually I would say rather than that, that if the partnership is a true collaboration and becomes, in a sense, a learning community between the researchers and the community partners, then the ownership of the research and the impact assessment is ours. It's not mine or theirs. It's ours, and to get to the place where things feel like it's ours takes a lot of work and a lot of time, and it's ideal, and we don't always get there, but that's what we should be striving for, I think. And just quickly, I resonated very strongly to the humility question. Couldn't agree more. I just quickly, in my research seminar with students, they were very judgmental often about the communities in which they were going. So we had to make a rule that I no longer could anybody make any statements. You only could ask questions. And that is very difficult. It was a really hard discipline, even for me. But I said, you have to enter communities with a beginner's mind. You don't know anything about these communities till you get to know them. And that's where the trust comes from, when they understand that these people from outside are actually genuinely curious about who they are and what they're doing.
Now that we have a minute, there's something that I would want to add that I forgot to mention. Still on AI, we should also be thinking not only of digitalizing evaluation methods, but also decolonizing them. Yeah, to ensure that data and models do not really overwrite the local wisdom, indigenous wisdom that we do have, but they speak to it, they dialogue with it. I'm sitting here imagining at the ethics boards, even having the communities sitting there right from the conceptualization and ethics stage. And representatives, of data science, speaking to lived narratives and not just counts. Because open data should not become an open exploitation, but it should become something that engages with the people that we serve. Thanks, Prof.
Okay, thank you very much. I just want, I don't want to summarize this because it might take time. But first of all, just to thank our discussants and our keynote speaker here. I think the message you left us with is you cannot, this is engaged research. So by design, communities are part of what you do. So assessment is not an afterthought. Whose research is it? Is ours. There are a number of things that you have suggested that we need to take into account for us to actually measure what matters. But what you also put as a challenge is that there are no standardized, metrics yet, of how to measure. I think Dr. Salome mentioned that, which we need as researchers to begin thinking about how do we evaluate these things robustly. Of course, with humility, because I think the point raised by Butle is quite important because there's always power differences even between researchers and communities. Whether consciously, sometimes unconsciously, you don't realize what you're doing. So I think the message has been taken, and can you please help me? Thank you very much. I don't know, Dr. Msi, my sincere apologies if you have any announcements. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Hongoro. It is always a hard decision to make, to not take everybody's questions and reply to them. But I am sure that we will find opportunities as we continue to network, to continue to ask and answer these questions, and also engage on our social media platforms on some of these discussions. Colleagues, we're now going to break into our last parallel sessions, and I'm going to request that you please consult with your program again, look at which of these sessions you would like to join, and make your way to those rooms. It is now 10:30. May I please request that we come back here for our last and final plenary session. I need to adjust the time a bit and allow us a few extra minutes. Should we come back here at 11:10? Sorry, 12:10. 10:12. I wanted to say 10:12. Should we come back here at 10:12? Not 12:15 as indicated in your program, but 10:12. Thank you. So please, facilitators, start the sessions on time and end them for us to be back in the venue at 10:12. Thank you.